This lesson is about respiration and how cells get energy. So there's several ways that cells can get energy. Some of that energy is going to be stored, but sometimes cells can get energy through a process, aerobic respiration, where oxygen is required. And sometimes cells get energy anaerobic respiration, where oxygen is not required. So to start, let's introduce you to a college-age girl named Brittany. She complains about feeling tired. She does exercise regularly, but instead of eating, she's spending a lot of time drinking water just to be healthy. So we want to investigate, how does this overconsumption of water influence and impact some of her health. To start, let's talk about energy and ATP as energy currency. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, just is an easy way that our body can store energy in a molecule simply by breaking one chemical bond between the second P and the third P, and we can get energy from that. It's kind of like a dollar bill when it comes to spending. It's easy to spend, and we have lots of it. So ATP is this energy currency, and the best part about it is it can be recycled. So all we need to do is add a phosphate to the ADP, the diphosphate, so adenosine diphosphate. We just add the phosphate and we can recharge that energy again. So see if you can just draw a picture of that nucleotide ATP from memory. When we start to exercise, our first source of energy is ATP. As we burn through that energy, we need to recharge that ATP, and we do that with creatine phosphate. So we're getting that phosphate from the creatine. So here's a person doing some jumping jacks, and as they're losing energy. It's kind of like paying out money. Once they run out of money, it's like running out of energy, and they can't do the work anymore, in this case, jumping jacks. So creatine phosphate charges or recharges that ADP so we can get our ATP back. So take a minute, see if you can answer those questions. This formula you've probably seen before, but you've seen it in the context of photosynthesis, going in the opposite direction. So here we have carbon dioxide and water, photosynthesis, but now these are the waste products of breaking down sugar in the presence of oxygen. The whole respiration overview looks something like this, and we'll look at each of these individual parts. But the key is the first step where we break the glucose down. That's going to be outside of the mitochondria, but then some of the reactions are going to happen inside the mitochondria. So when we talk about the mitochondria being the energy producer or the powerhouse of the cell, this is how it's the powerhouse of the cell. Here's another look at that same process, but this time you can see how the ATP is being manufactured. So take a close look and keep track of the ATP, and notice that some of these processes cost ATP, but they're worth it, because if we can gain more than we spend, the process is worth it. So the first step is going to be glycolysis. So after we've burned through the ATP, recharge it with creatine phosphate. Number 2, glycolysis. In this case, we're going to break a glucose molecule away from the glycogen, the large complex carbohydrate, and we're going to split that glucose molecule. Glycolysis. Lysis means to split, and we're splitting a glucose. That gives us 2 ATP. Now, it costs us some to do that. It costs us 2, but we manufacture 4, so we have a net gain of 2. When we do, those individual pyruvates, like the half of the glucose molecule, can be used to recharge ATP, and here's how. Pyruvate kinase, an enzyme that's going to add that third phosphate back to an ADP in order to recharge it. So that's the process of glycolysis in a nutshell. But what we're looking for is that pyruvate, or that pyruvic acid, that half of a glucose molecule. What happens to it? In the mitochondria, then, that's where we're going to use that, and we're going to get some ATP from it. So again, look back at these questions and see if you can answer some of these questions. So that's ATP as energy currency. Now, let's start to look at aerobic respiration. What happens to that pyruvate, that half a glucose molecule, in the presence of oxygen? So glycolysis, again, we're splitting that glucose. We get these 2 pyruvates. Now we're moving from the cytoplasm outside the cell, or sorry, outside the organelles into the mitochondria, into the organelle. So the first thing that's going to happen is this thing called the Krebs cycle. And when that happens, we're converting pyruvate through a series of chemical reactions into something called acetyl-CoA. That happens on the membranes of the mitochondria. That's going to cost us some ATP. It's also going to generate a little bit of ATP. But the real big payoff comes with the electron transport chain. So we have our acetyl-CoA in the presence of oxygen, and through a series of chemical reactions, we can manufacture a lot of ATP. Notice that there are some waste products given off, namely carbon dioxide and water. So think back to that last question. If Brittany's drinking a lot of water, one of the problems is going to be that her blood sugar level is going to be so diluted, it's going to be hard to get sugar molecules to the cell. Now, normally sugar and glycogen is stored in muscle cells or the liver and has to circulate through the blood. So if that blood's very diluted, then it's going to be hard for cells to get the sugar that they need. So you'll notice that the Krebs cycle, it requires oxygen, it generates some ATP, and it gives off carbon dioxide as a byproduct. The electron transport chain generates 34 ATP, and then it gives off some water as a byproduct. So think about, again, if Brittany's been ingesting too much water and there's a lot of water in her blood, that water is going to go into her cells. And if there's a lot of water into her cells, it's going to be hard to get rid of this waste product if it can't be diffused out. Take a look at these 4 steps and see if you can pause the video and put them into order. So here again is our little diagram that we're trying to follow. Notice over here where the water spigot is. If we were to shut that off because there's so much water in the cell already and that water can't get out, what would the problems be as that waste product backs up into the mitochondria? So here we have glycolysis. Step 1, we're splitting the glucose. The Krebs cycle, we get a little bit of ATP from that. 2, electron transport chain, that's where we're getting our major energy payoffs. So what would happen to Brittany's energy level if the excess water damages her mitochondria? So think about what's the job of mitochondria, what would happen? So now let's say that there is no oxygen available, or if you're exercising and you can't get oxygen to your muscles fast enough, what happens then? You don't keel over. What happens is you switch from aerobic respiration to anaerobic respiration. So that's this Y right here. So glycolysis is all the same, but instead of going to the Krebs cycle where oxygen is required, now we're turning this direction and we're going to what's called fermentation, a fermentation reaction, where either, if it's a plant, alcohol is made, or if it's a human or animal, lactic acid is made. We feel that lactic acid being made. It burns our muscles. So we feel that burning in our muscles. So to take that pathway, glycolysis is all the same. But now that pyruvate, instead of going through the Krebs cycle with oxygen, it's going to be fermented. And when that happens, we're going to build up some lactic acid. Now, we're also going to manufacture some ATP. But you'll notice instead of like 34, we're only manufacturing 2. So that creates a major problem because you have this energy of 34, now it drops off to 2. You can't continue to perform at the same level. So here's what that looks like chemically. That glucose is getting split. We get some ATP from it. Then we have these pyruvate. They're going to be chemically changed into lactate. We get this intermediate energy molecule. And we're going to get some ATP, but not nearly what we would if it was aerobic respiration. So pause the video, see if you can answer those 2 questions. And that's going to wrap up our little overview of cellular respiration.